He destroyed my career. Just for fun, 3 years later, karma made sure he'd never work again. I never thought I'd share this story with anyone outside my immediate circle, but the memory of how one person went out of his way to wreck my career and how karma caught up with him still sends a strange thrill through my veins. Part of me wants to pretend it never happened, but another part knows it might help someone who's feeling as powerless as I did back then. So here it goes. 3 years of my life boiled down into one outrageous saga of betrayal, downfall, and sweet, sweet retribution. I still remember the morning it all started to unravel, clear as day. I was standing in front of the mirror in my cramped studio apartment, tying my tie with the same combination of nerves and excitement that had accompanied me for weeks. You see, I was on the cusp of a big project announcement at work, something I'd labored over for months. The final presentation was set for that very afternoon, and my manager had hyped it up as a major step forward for our department. I couldn't help picturing myself stepping up to the podium in our company's large conference hall, the overhead lights casting a glow on the stage, my slides seamlessly clicking by as I delivered a passionate pitch about our new initiative. Part of me was already rehearsing jokes and anticipating the applause, typical grandiose illusions you get when you've poured your heart into something. Anyway, I finished that tie knot, grabbed my keys, and headed out, buzzing with anticipation. The company I worked for back then was called Skylark Innovations. Sounds fancy, right? In a way, it was. The office was perched on the 33rd floor of a sleek skyscraper downtown, offering a panoramic view of the city. When I arrived, I rode the elevator up with a bunch of other suits who either stared at their phones or made small talk about the weather. My mind was on one thing, the big reveal. What I didn't know was that across the hall, Mark Henderson, my newly assigned teammate, was already laying the groundwork for the fiasco that would nuke my reputation. Mark and I had a complicated relationship from day one. When he joined Skylark, he came with a swagger that suggested he believed he was the smartest person in any room. I can't lie. He was talented. He had a background in data analytics and a knack for schmoozing the execs, but there was always something off about the way he'd smile at you. It reminded me of a kid playing with a magnifying glass over an anthill, the kind of grin someone wears when they're amused by the idea of causing destruction. But hey, maybe that was just me being paranoid. I tried to welcome him with an open mind, because that's the sort of person I aspired to be. Collaborative, friendly, the team player who helps new hires settle in. A few weeks after his arrival, Mark and I were teamed up on what was shaping up to be the biggest contract in our division. It involved a new software platform for a major healthcare client. Huge potential, big budget, lots of eyes on us from upstairs. I was thrilled, of course. This was the most significant challenge I'd ever been entrusted with, and my manager, Steven, made it clear. Nail this, and the sky's the limit. I took that as a personal challenge. Mark, for his part, seemed less starry-eyed. He acted like he'd been there, done that, and that nothing in this world could impress him anymore. But I knew he must have been giddy beneath that veneer, because the project promised the sort of recognition that can transform a mid-level employee into a corporate darling overnight. I started noticing weird little things almost immediately. Mark would offer me constructive feedback in front of the entire team, making it sound like I was skipping crucial details or missing obvious opportunities. During private meetings, however, he'd flash that lazy grin and say everything I was doing was top-notch. I chalked it up to a difference in communication styles. Maybe he believed that criticizing me openly made us look more rigorous or thorough. It was annoying, but I let it slide. I was too focused on the end goal to get hung up on his mind games. Over time, though, the tension built up in subtle ways. For instance, Mark would go out for a casual coffee with Steven, then come back and pass along changes to the project plan. They always coincidentally seemed to undercut my suggestions or overshadow my leadership. At first, I thought, okay, so Steven wants these adjustments. Cool, I'm flexible. But then I started noticing that Steven looked just as surprised by these changes as I was. It dawned on me that Mark was simply making moves on his own, name-dropping Steven to give them weight, and hoping nobody would check with him directly. Shady, right? And I should have confronted him right then, but I was too busy tying up 100 loose ends. One small, manipulative act at a time, Mark positioned himself as the driving force behind our project while painting me as a useful but rather clueless sidekick. I didn't realize just how deep it went until the day of that dreaded presentation. I spent the entire morning reviewing my slides, cross-checking data, ensuring everything was bulletproof. The meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. At 12:30, I got an urgent email from Mark telling me to meet him in conference room B ASAP. I figured maybe some new info had come in from the client or the analytics team. But when I arrived, Mark was lounging in one of the swivel chairs, twirling a pen between his fingers, and glancing up at me with that smug half-smile. "Hey," I said. What's going on? He shrugged and motioned for me to take a seat. Then he launched into a monologue about how he'd gone over the final project deck and found major discrepancies in the financial projections. I tried to fix them myself, he drawled, but it's bigger than I thought. You might need to rewrite a chunk of the pitch. My stomach dropped. Discrepancies? I double-checked everything last night. Are you sure? Because I personally verified the numbers with the finance department. He shrugged again like he couldn't be bothered. All I know is they don't match the final report we have on file. And these new numbers I have from Steven's side, well, they're quite different. Time was ticking, and I couldn't afford a meltdown. So I scrambled for my laptop, asked him to forward me the alleged new data, and started comparing. Sure enough, the numbers I'd carefully compiled were correct according to the documents I had. But the files Mark emailed me, supposedly from Steven, showed entirely different figures. If I used Mark's version, we'd come off as incompetent in the eyes of the client, because they contradicted the data the client had initially provided. If I stuck to mine, Mark was hinting I'd be ignoring an official update from my manager. It was a no-win scenario, but I didn't see that yet. I just panicked. We had 90 minutes before the presentation, so I was like a madman, calling the finance department, trying to confirm which set of numbers was correct. Nobody picked up. Lunchtime, of course. And apparently everyone decided to vanish for the day. Meanwhile, Mark just sat there, occasionally typing on his phone, probably texting God knows who about how the drama was unfolding. Finally, with about half an hour to go, I decided to trust my gut. I'd use the numbers I knew to be right. And if Mark wanted to present contradictory data, he could argue that with Steven. I updated my slides accordingly, saved them to the shared drive, and rushed off to the conference room. The presentation was a blur. I got up on stage, introduced our project, and started walking everyone through the concept. Then, I hit the financial slides. As soon as I clicked to the next screen, my heart nearly stopped. The slides displayed numbers I'd never seen before. The ones Mark had sent. The inconsistent set. I froze. A murmur rippled through the small audience. Steven raised an eyebrow in confusion, because it obviously clashed with the internal reviews he'd seen from me earlier. My face burned. I tried to correct it verbally, stumbling over disclaimers like, I apologize, there seems to be an error here. Let me clarify the real figures, but the momentum was gone. The mood in the room went from mildly curious to painfully awkward. Mark quickly jumped in, giving off the impression that he was swooping in to save me from my own oversight. He said something along the lines of, I noticed the discrepancy just in time and thought you'd had a chance to update the deck. Maybe we can circle back to finalize details. He laughed it off like it was a small snag, but I could sense the faint hostility in his tone. Everyone else in the room just shifted in their seats. When it ended, I felt like I'd just stumbled off a battlefield with no idea who'd attacked me or why. Afterward, Mark conveniently vanished, while Steven cornered me in the hallway. What the hell was that? He demanded. I stammered that someone must have switched my slides last minute, that the numbers on screen weren't the ones I'd prepared. He glared like he didn't believe a word. Look, he said, I need you to fix this ASAP. This kind of mix-up makes us look disorganized. Then he walked off, leaving me alone with the sinking feeling that the trust I'd earned was rapidly slipping through my fingers. I confronted Mark later, but he denied everything, claimed that when he opened the deck in the shared drive, the new slides were already there. It didn't help that he'd told me in that last-minute meeting about the other data, so I looked incompetent either way. Over the next few days, I found out that Mark had also been feeding stories to a couple of colleagues about me ignoring important updates and rushing to finalize materials without double-checking. They acted sympathetic to my face, but behind my back they started questioning my thoroughness. I was appalled at how quickly your reputation can skid downhill once someone starts sowing doubts. That fiasco was just the beginning. For the next few months, Mark systematically chipped away at my credibility. He'd volunteer me for tasks without telling me, then when they didn't get done, because I didn't even know about them. He'd point out to management that I was dropping the ball. He'd forward emails to me with crucial information missing, then turn around and CC me in threads to show I'd read his messages. If I tried to keep him at arm's length or work around him, he'd drop insinuations that I was being petty or refusing to collaborate. If I escalated my concerns to Steven, he'd calmly wave them off, saying Mark was just enthusiastic, and maybe I should manage him better. It was psychological warfare, and I was outplayed at every turn. Gradually, I realized Mark wasn't just a random jerk. He enjoyed the chaos he was creating. It was like a game to him. Subtly push me toward making mistakes, build a narrative around my incompetence, then stand back and watch as I struggled to defend myself. And because I had been so gung-ho about the project from the beginning, the downfall was all the more spectacular. He picked the perfect victim in me, someone who'd grown comfortable and trusting in the environment, who believed that good work would always be recognized if you just did your job right. Eventually, the dam broke. One especially high-pressure day, Mark managed to pin an entire budget oversight on me. He claimed I'd greenlit a third-party vendor's cost without proper approval. The email thread he dug up showed my name on it. But to this day, I swear he must have manipulated something or forwarded the request at a time I was swamped, burying it in a flood of other emails. The upshot was that our finance department freaked out. The client threatened to renegotiate, and Stephen demanded a meeting in his office with me, Mark, and 2 other managers. That meeting was like a tribunal. Stephen gave me one shot to explain the discrepancy. I had no concrete proof that Mark had orchestrated anything. All I had were suspicions and a gut feeling that I was being set up. Mark, of course, played the loyal co-worker who was so disappointed that I'd missed such a vital step. The managers in the room seemed to side with him. He had all the receipts, literally. I left that meeting with a suspension letter in hand, pending further investigation. It felt unreal. My entire career had exploded in the space of an hour, and I was left reeling in confusion and anger. I remember getting home that night to my tiny apartment, sinking onto my couch and staring at the ceiling for hours. My phone buzzed nonstop, friends from work asking if the rumors were true, if I was really leaving Skylark, if I was okay. I felt too humiliated to answer most of them. The only message I replied to was from my buddy Jason in marketing, who'd been warning me about Mark's manipulations for a while. He wrote, "Dude, I'm so sorry. You know Mark is behind this, right? Steven basically worships him." I just typed back, "Yeah, I know," turned off my phone, and tried not to scream. The official investigation dragged on for about 2 weeks. But honestly, I think the outcome was decided from day one. Skylark needed a scapegoat to appease the disgruntled client. Mark was riding high on his record of fixing mistakes, the ones he created, and I was conveniently the sucker in the hot seat. The final verdict: they terminated me, citing gross negligence and failure to follow internal protocols. It felt like a punch to the gut after years of loyal service. The worst part was the hush-hush nature of it. They told me I was free to leave quietly, that they wouldn't oppose me collecting unemployment, but if any future employer asked, they'd simply verify my dates of employment and not comment further. That was their version of mercy. I wish I could say I left in a blaze of righteous fury, confronting Mark in front of everyone, but the truth is, I slunk out like a man defeated. I piled my belongings into a cardboard box, took the elevator down alone, and walked out of that gleaming tower feeling like the biggest fool on earth. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I applied for job after job, got a handful of interviews, but the references always tripped me up. Apparently, Skylark's neutral approach didn't do me any favors. Recruiters could sense something was off when my old manager refused to say a single positive thing about my time there. My savings dwindled. I started picking up odd contract work just to pay rent and keep the lights on. Meanwhile, Mark was posting pictures from corporate events, clinking champagne glasses with top executives, celebrating new successes. The bitterness consumed me, but I felt powerless to do anything. No one believed me or cared. That was the darkest time of my life, no question. I nearly moved back in with my parents in Indiana, but a sliver of pride kept me from tailing it back home. I ended up doing freelance consulting for small businesses, focusing on marketing strategies. It was a far cry from the big projects I'd once led, but it was honest work, and it slowly helped me regain a sense of worth. Over time, I tried to push the memories of Skylark and Mark out of my mind. I put my head down, made new connections, and quietly tried to reassemble my career from the wreckage. Then, about a year later, I got wind of changes happening at Skylark. Jason called to say that Mark had gone even more power-hungry. He apparently stepped on a few too many toes, but no one was sure how high his protection went. The rumor was that Mark used every dirty trick in the book to climb up the ladder. He manipulated budgets, set up colleagues to fail, and spun elaborate stories to cover himself. I listened with a grim feeling of déjà vu, but I also knew that eventually, this sort of behavior escalates to a point that not even the best silver tongue can talk its way out of. Sure enough, rumors started circulating in the industry that Skylark had missed major deadlines and gone over budget on multiple fronts. They'd overpromised to clients, all under Mark's leadership. But Mark had an uncanny ability to slip away from responsibility, shifting blame to subordinates or even external factors. The difference this time was that the scale of the failures was becoming too big to hide behind his usual scapegoats. And apparently, he was making enemies in high places by hogging credit and alienating his own managers. I was well into my second year post-Skylark by the time the big scandal broke. It turned out Mark had been falsifying metrics to secure a multi-million-dollar contract. He doctored performance reports to make Skylark look more capable than it was. And when the client discovered the mismatch between promise and reality, the fallout was massive. Mark tried every trick. He pointed fingers at co-managers, claimed faulty data from the analytics team, even implied that certain individuals had withheld key information from him. But this time, the executives he was so eager to impress wanted results, not excuses. The client threatened legal action. All eyes focused on Mark. With the pressure rising, he finally cracked. He could no longer hide behind his web of lies because senior leadership was desperate to contain the scandal and needed a sacrificial lamb. It was surreal hearing the news. Jason sent me an article detailing the fiasco, how Skylark's contract was in jeopardy, how there were internal investigations, and how Mark Henderson was put on indefinite leave. A few days later, another piece emerged, stating Mark had officially been terminated. Skylark's legal team was reportedly building a case against him for misrepresentation and possible fraud. I remember reading the article, feeling my pulse thrum in my ears. I kept waiting for the rush of euphoria, the big, "I told you so" moment. Instead, I mostly felt a kind of hollow relief. Yes, he'd finally gotten what was coming to him, but there was no going back in time to undo the damage he inflicted on me. The best I could do was move forward. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't crack a smile at the poetic justice of it all. A week after Mark's firing went public, Stephen reached out to me. To be honest, it stunned me. He'd never tried to contact me after I left Skylark, not even a courtesy text. Now, apparently, with Mark's lies laid bare, Stephen felt the need to clear the air. We met at a coffee shop near my new place. He insisted on coming to me. The man sitting across from me was a far cry from the confident manager I remembered. He looked older, more worn, fidgeting with his cup like he had a million regrets. He apologized profusely, admitting he and the other managers had been hoodwinked by Mark's manipulations. He told me with genuine remorse how Mark had systematically fabricated evidence to undermine me, how they discovered emails Mark never passed on, and how the so-called budget oversight was entirely Mark's creation. Skylark's name was on the line, and Stephen realized he'd destroyed the wrong person's career by trusting the actual culprit. I listened, nodding at all the right times, but not letting him off the hook too easily. It took everything in me not to start yelling about how his incompetence and favoritism had cost me a year of my life, my confidence, and a job I once loved. In the end, though, I accepted his apology. There was nothing else I could do. Stephen even offered to write a letter explaining the real circumstances, something I could show to potential employers if needed. He said Skylark would be willing to make amends. I wasn't naive enough to think this was purely altruistic. They were terrified I might sue or spill the beans about the fiasco. But I took the letter, thankful that at least I had an official piece of paper vindicating me. Word spread quickly in our professional circles that Mark was persona non grata. No big company wanted to touch him, especially after Skylark dropped the legal hammer. As for me, that letter Stephen wrote helped me land a far better position than any I'd interviewed for previously. A rapidly growing software firm, Archer Tech, snapped me up after seeing my record and reading Stephen's apology letter. They admired the resilience I'd shown and were sympathetic to my ordeal. I started out as a project lead, quickly moved up the ranks, and found myself surrounded by people who genuinely appreciated my contributions. It felt like I'd finally arrived where I was supposed to be, free from the shadow Mark had cast. 3 years have passed since that day Skylark pushed me out. I'm in a much better place, both personally and professionally. Sometimes, when I'm waiting in line for coffee or stuck in traffic, I'll remember Mark's smug face, how he seemed so invincible, and I catch myself shaking my head. I guess the moral is that the higher you climb on lies, the further you fall when the truth surfaces. And surface it did, burying Mark so deeply that I doubt he'll ever get back into any respectable position in our industry. I used to fantasize about confronting him in a triumphant blaze of glory, maybe telling him how his betrayal almost broke me, but how I rose above it while he sank in his own deception. But as time went on, I realized I didn't need that moment. The best revenge was living well. Watching him crumble under the weight of his own lies was just a bonus. I heard he tried to freelance for a while, but word of mouth travels fast in our line of work. Once people understood he was the Mark Henderson from the Skylark scandal, doors slammed shut. Last I heard, he was bouncing between short-term gigs, none of which ever made it to his resume because they ended so quickly. Apparently, he threatened to sue Skylark for wrongful termination, but with the incriminating evidence they had, he didn't stand a chance. A few months ago, an old colleague texted me out of the blue. She said Mark was sending out frantic LinkedIn messages to past contacts, begging for introductions or references. Most people ignored him. She attached a screenshot of one of his messages, full of desperate flattery and false promises of how he'd grown from his experiences. I laughed out loud, then felt a twinge of pity, not for Mark himself, but for anyone who still had to interact with him. Some people never learn, I guess. And that's my story. He destroyed my career for fun, But 3 years later, Karma made sure he'd never work again, at least not in any capacity that would satisfy his arrogant ambitions. Am I bitter? Sure, sometimes. The scars are there, and I'll always wonder how different my life would have been if I hadn't crossed paths with him. But in a strange way, I'm also grateful. I grew tougher. I learned to trust my instincts about people. I learned to stand up for myself, even if it means ruffling feathers. The taste of success I have now is even sweeter knowing how low I once felt. So if you're reading this and find yourself facing someone who seems hell-bent on ruining you for kicks, remember my tale. Sometimes the road to justice is long and winding. You might stumble through a year or two of darkness, but hold on to your skills, your dignity, and whatever faith you can muster in your own abilities. Because eventually, manipulative people trip over their own lies, and when they do, the crash is often spectacular. I learned that firsthand. So keep your head up, document everything, and know that sometimes karma just needs time to brew the perfect storm. Once it hits, it's unstoppable, and the view from the other side is oh so glorious.